Good morning. This is the 9th annual Produced by Conference. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to, just make sure you're at the right session, Turning Digital Disruption into Creative Opportunities. And I want to thank the sponsors of the session, ARRI and Technicolor. Yes, thank you. We applaud them. It's great because this is the 5th year they are supporting the conference together, and they've been very loyal to our guild and supporting our guild. So thank you to both companies. Before we get started with our first session, I also want to say thank you to 20th Century Fox Studios. I mean, they're hosting our whole conference, and they do I think you saw a beautiful job, right, guys? Really, really pretty. Thank you very much. As a courtesy, I'll be saying this again later today, but cell phones, please silence them. Please make it a point. I mean, I know you might want to keep them on for notes, but silence them.
Us, right?
Okay, Ian, hold on a minute.
What? I'm just talking to my friend.
Yeah, you're right. You want to do that on the speakers too, yes.
Yeah.
And
Sorry.
and that's all I have to say. Have a lot of fun, and I'm going to introduce you now to the moderator today. Is tech editor at The Hollywood Reporter, Carolyn Giardina. Sorry about that. Carolyn, it's all yours.
Good morning. So just to give you the lay of the land, we're going to talk for about an hour, and then we're going to leave about 10-15 minutes at the end for your questions. I'm going to start by introducing our speakers. On the end, we have Ian Bryce, who produced Saving Private Ryan and all 5 Transformers movies, and he just finished the latest one very early this morning. Seated next to him is Bob Eicholz, who's the CTO at Technicolor Production Services. Next to him is Glenn Kennel, who's the president and CEO of ARRI. Then we have your PGA president, Lori McCreary, who's CEO of Revelations Entertainment, and her credits include Invictus and Madam Secretary. And on the end, we have director of photography, Daryn Okada, whose credits include Mean Girls and Scandal, which he just finished up for the season. So when we looked at the topic, this notion of turning digital disruption into creative opportunities, we basically learned that covers pretty much everything, everything from pre-pro to delivery. So we are going to try to touch on some of the ones that are having some areas that we're seeing a lot of change this past year. And then we can, when we do questions, hopefully we can touch on some additional ones. But for starters, because of all the digital tools that you have available to you, from onset tools to workflows going into post-production, you can speed up your production processes at different places and for different creative purposes. And I thought it would be great to start with Ian, because he certainly has some great examples from Transformers 5, which he is very much fresh on his mind right now. So Ian, would you like to start?
Yeah, morning everybody. I think the digital disruption has lots and lots of pluses. Daryn, I'm sure will take us through some of the camera platforms. But as everything has switched over from film to digital, from a producer standpoint, there's a lot of flexibility in the digital world, and we can shoot faster, we can shoot a lot more. You tend to need less light, right? So the directors and cinematographers can shoot more, right? And leave the cameras on. So whereas, before film was expensive and we tended to shoot less and you turn the camera off after takes. And now I find that cameras run and run and run. And that's all good. So we're faster and more flexible on the front end of the equation. And then we start seeing what happens, which is storage, whether it be cloud storage, whether it's card storage, whatever it may be. And we were just talking in a little prep session about, a word that's now coming into the lexicon, which is the petabyte. The petabyte, which is 1,000 terabytes of storage. So our film in picture is past a petabyte of storage.
1 million gigabytes.
Yeah, it's massive, right? And so, and everybody should get a chance to talk about this, but that's where you start to get interesting, is because there's so much data to manage from so many formats, 2D, 3D, different countries. All of that data is helpful at the end, because we couldn't deliver at 5:30 this morning and have a print in China on Tuesday night were it not for the ability to ship files through the internet, right? And yet it bottlenecks, right? Because people like Mike know that he can go to the very last moment and torture ILM and everybody else and just like take it right down to the limit, because he knows, right? He knows that once he's finished, they start pressing buttons and stuff ends up in China, right? So, but there's a huge amount of work that comes in that part of the process, which I'm sure everybody else would like to talk about as well.
Bob, you're focusing a lot on cloud at the
I am.
moment, so
Yeah.
do you want to take it from
I would
here?
love to. So for us, this is an incredibly exciting time. It's also a really scary time because our business is being virtualized. What's happening right now is a lot of the major studios are becoming more comfortable with having content in the cloud. Last year it was render. This year it's storage. And what does that do? That brings the players like Google and Microsoft and Amazon. All of a sudden, these companies who have huge technical infrastructures around the globe are interested. And so recently, for example, on Jungle Book, there was a lot of last-minute creativity on that project. And we need as much infrastructure as we have around the globe. We don't have enough. We needed more. And so we partnered with Disney and Google. And at the last minute, we rented just short of 50,000 cores, if you know what a core is, 50,000 cores in the cloud, and we're able to render. So back to, how does this enable creativity? Well, honestly, we couldn't have done a lot of the last minute creativity without that. That's just the beginning. So when we talk about a petabyte, we talk about 10 petabytes, talk about HDR, talk about 4K to 8K. The storage demands are going to increase exponentially. But the exciting thing is the big players who provide infrastructure that can handle that are interested in this now, and they're all over this industry. So it's really an amazing time.
Lori,
Well,
how much footage are you shooting, and how are you dealing with the data requirements?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I love your use of last-minute creativity, because I call it changes, and I like last-minute creativity. I am going to use that. Well, so I have so we're shooting a show right now in 4K, and we were in Africa for about 30 days, and we wouldn't have been able to do that even 2 or 3 years ago with the amount of storage that you need in the cameras. Cameras are now smaller, and what I found is that the cost is about the same on set. What happens is you have to have more DITs, especially we're also doing an 8K show.
To put some of that in context, when Lori mentioned an 8K project, that's 16 times more data than what you're commonly working with today. High dynamic range is more data. So, Lori, from a producer standpoint, when you're in pre-pro, what are the things that you're talking about with your suppliers? What are you planning with the workflow so that all of this is in place when you go into production?
Well, I'm a big believer in testing. So we did an end-to-end test before we even got out in the field, because it was a remote location. And so we had our cameras on site at our office, we had our DIT, we had a bunch of RAID drives to figure out how much it was going to take. So we did about 15 minutes of shooting full on with one camera, and we were going to have 4 in the field. So it's really, you just need mathematicians around you to do the mathematics to figure out how much storage you're going to need. But I think that the biggest thing is to make sure that you test the camera, test the workflow, so that when you get it out of the camera, you know how many. We needed 4 cards for each camera, because that's how long it was going to take to transfer the other 3 cards. By the time we got to the 4th one, we were going to barely get the 4th card, the first card that we started with, back around. So it's really important for you, just as a practical matter, to really test how it's going to work, especially if you're going to shoot in a remote location. And like I said, you're going to have to add DITs and AEs, assistant editors, because they're the ones that are going to have, as Ian was saying, oftentimes the directors don't turn off your cameras, which is really great in the field and great for your actors and really, really hard for your assistant editors because they're spending a lot of time trying to figure out, wait, is this the take? Oh, no. Oh, is that the take? Wait, which is the take?
But it's great if you're the seller of the petabyte
Yes,
thing.
exactly. It's fantastic, and it's going to be more fantastic for Google and Microsoft and all those people that are storing all that data that you may or may not need.
Daryn, why don't you jump in here?
Well, I do everything that Lori does, and I even take it, I've been taking it further all the way to, actually putting some images up in a timing theater, just take a half hour, do that, make sure the workflow is sound. But for me, being on the set, the last thing I want to do is, while shooting film, last thing I want to do is run out of film. So just like what Lori was talking about, I time out what the round trip of these cards are going to be and then pad it a little. Because until you can get another card back on the set, when you get the all clear, the data's good when it leaves the set and it's on protected drives and everything else. That's the most important thing. And now that we're dealing with regularly not a small amount of data, this is a lot of data. I mean, it's important to know what the whole pace of that shoot's going to be. Are you shooting? I mean, I'm used to shooting 3 or more cameras on everything, so I have to kind of gauge that whole situation. But if you know that it's a character-based movie or a television project, and you know that if it's longer takes because it's going to be emotional, you have to kind of gauge that. But you can do it very easily just by figuring out what the shoot, what that time on the set the camera is going to be running, and then back it into what through your tests. How long does it physically take a particular crew setup to bring those cards back to the set? And that's how also, do we need to budget for another DIT? Do we need to budget for additional people so we can turn that over? Because the one thing you don't want to happen, and luckily it's never happened to me, is a card comes back on set, gets erased, and it didn't go through it because everybody was freaking out and wanted to get a card back. So
They didn't want to make the actors wait.
yeah.
I just want to add, because Daryn just reminded me, when we did the 8K test, we projected it, and what we were not anticipating is about the top 15 to 18% of the screen you can't perceive. We projected it on a big IMAX screen. You don't really, your eye, I don't know what it is about the humans. So everything like the top 18%, we had to make sure was not important information in the scenes. And I think it's really, really important to go all the way through to your display device so that I mean, we could have spent so much money in post trying to kind of blow everything up and pull it down. So it was a really great thing. And Daryn, if you guys don't remember, was one of the main people. Remember when we did the camera assessment series way back when? Daryn was one of the instigators of that. So
Instigators, yeah.
visionaries.
So, Glenn, from your standpoint, when you're meeting with cinematographers and talking about shoots, what are the questions they're asking, and what are some of the misconceptions about things like high dynamic range and about resolution?
Well, I'd like to talk about LED lighting too, but maybe that's down the road.
That too.
Well, so I think, digital cameras are widely accepted now. There's still some film being shot, but the majority of production is digital, and it's been probably about 10 years since we've adopted digital cameras. The Alexa camera, by the way, is 7 years old now. Surprisingly, it doesn't seem like that long, but we've been able to update it and upgrade it and add features and capabilities and all sorts of things, and now the product family is much bigger. But digital, of course, allows you to set up and shoot in less light. I think it's still important that you have light and that you control it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about digital lighting, particularly LED lighting, now that the technology has advanced to the point that we have very high quality, digitally controlled LED lights. It's lower power, it's less heat. Those are good things for quick setup. You don't need generators, you can plug them in the wall, things like that. But it also, with color tunable lights like the Sky Panel that we introduced a couple years ago, which is now, selling like hotcakes, and everyone's using it. This is technology that has been used in live events and theater for years, but is now being embraced on film and TV sets. And it allows you to rig the lights, set them up, set the color. But then instead of climbing ladders to gel the lights like we traditionally did, you just tune a different color through a control panel. And that can be a wireless control. It can be an app. It can be set up through a DMX control panel. But it really leads to some new production efficiencies. I think I'd rather have Daryn talk about his own experience with it. But I think this is sort of another revolution in where digital technology is impacting the way we shoot our movies.
Daryn and Lori both actually had thoughts on LEDs when we were planning, so go ahead.
Oh, we'll have to go again first. She always does this to me. Well, the interesting thing is that all these technologies are sort of coming together at the same time, which is exciting for the whole industry. As far as the LED lights, years, it's been probably maybe 5 years when I got actually burnt by an early LED light because it didn't reproduce
Literally burnt, or?
It burnt the look of the actress.
Okay.
It had this, her face was totally blue and really bright, and yet you couldn't see it. So then that led into this. Of course, I'd bring up a thing, and I get asked to co-chair a committee at the Academy, which was a solid-state lighting project. So then now this whole dialogue of exactly what is a solid-state light or LED light, and to have it reproduce what a tungsten light would be. So we brought in all this language, and luckily now all the manufacturers have jumped in. So today it's great because it made everybody aware of what these issues are, and we can take these lights and do things in places that we normally couldn't with the amount of time, and just introduce greater production value. I had a episode this year. We did these 4 sort of standalone Grey's Anatomy episodes in the middle of our Scandal schedule. This was my 2-year experiment in television. I said, let's step away from features. Let's do TV for 2 years. I think I'm going to go back to features now. But it was all in an airplane. The whole episode was going to be on a plane, which we've all done. We know what those situations are. What I was able to do is, instead of rigging everything outside of the windows with all kinds of light to make different looks, runway, things like that, I just used these ARRI Sky panels, very small. I put 8 down one side, 8 down the other side, and I did every effect from lightning to the blue lights as you're taxiing, to red lights, to the glow, to even made one of them flash as if it's the navigation strobe in the back of a part of a wing. But I was able to do that. I had it programmed in 6 hours, so I had a pre-rig crew do it. If we were to try to introduce that kind of production value on in any other way in a short term, it would be impossible financially. And also, what was great is I was able to keep all that going with less crew, because I didn't need a person on each thing. I had a great dimmer board operator, and we programmed it. But that's where these sort of lights. Also, we didn't need a lot of power or air conditioning, because air conditioning takes power. So all these technologies all kind of that are feeding into this whole, sort of a great opportunity right now for, I think, the industry.
Lori.
I just want to take a moment to just say the men on this panel do so many things behind the scenes that we will never see. Besides just doing their job, they're like going to sets, seeing what we need, taking what we learned on sets, going to the technology companies, and really making the tools that we use as producers much more efficient and much more usable when the film comes out in the end. And it's something they do above and beyond their normal, what they get paid for. And I think it's really important that we just acknowledge these guys and say thank you for that.
As one of the people who actually does get paid for that, because that is what I do. I have to tell you, I think this year a lot of the technology companies are listening to us more than ever.
That's great.
We
That's
really have
fantastic.
their attention. For years, I've been saying Hollywood has not just petabytes, but exabytes of data to deal with. Intel, Microsoft, Google, aren't you guys interested in that? This is potentially a huge business for us. And this year, we've taken that message to them and said, guys and gals, this is a potential huge business for you. And why don't you sit down and listen to us? And so they get it.
So
It's
Bob,
exciting.
so Bob, we talk about, rendering, we talk about storage. What are some of the other areas that you see on the way?
Global collaboration. I'm really excited about global collaboration. If you look at the history of this industry, it has been, because of technical constraints, it's been very location based. You had to have all of the technology in one place. You had to have all the people in one place. As the internet and cloud moves into this, there's no reason that somebody in a country, I don't even know what country, let's say Brazil, pick a country who has talent, can't work with us on our projects. Now we have, somebody will bring up security, which that's something that's under me as well. So I have to wear both hats. I believe that's going to get worked out. So another trend here is the ability not just to harness all this data, but to be able to do it globally. For folks to be able to find a place to work, like an Airbnb for our industry. This is stuff that's all coming, and in fact, if you just spend some time out on the internet, you'll find it already exists. There are companies out there that are saying, we believe that we can be a studio, an animation studio, for example, without a physical location. And that starts to get really exciting. And for companies like us, this is really scary because, we have a huge investment in our physical locations. Those locations aren't going to go away, but we want to play, and we decided let's try to play in this new world rather than just sitting back and watching it happen. So let's see where it goes, because the dream is, and I love the title of the session, the dream is that the technology ought to get out of the way of the creativity, and the creativity then can go global, and we don't even know where that's going to take us.
Now, Bob, you also touched on the topic of security, and that was something I did want to bring up because certainly with the scare and in recent weeks where something may have been hacked, it's been a big topic. How secure is our data? What do producers need to know?
I think today there's a lot of risk out there. I think if you look at the history of the industry, we've gone from a lot of location-based facilities that each have their own security. I mean, in Technicolor we have 40 locations, and they're, who knows how many visual effects shops. Each of those shops has a technical environment that has to be protected. And the protection is only as good as the people who are there on a day-to-day basis. For my facilities, I can mandate all the rules that I want to, but unless I really check globally for each of those sites, I'm not sure that I'm secure. I think I do a good job, but what the change is going to bring, the change is going to come with, I think, the migration to the cloud providers and more centralized facilities as we migrate to that model and storing the data instead of in 100 different locations, storing them in bigger facilities. I think that's going to present an opportunity for better security, not worse. I think the studios rightly were concerned 2 years ago, saying we don't want our data in a public cloud. But now that they've studied it and now that we understand it a little bit better, I think a lot of them are saying, we're okay with this. So to me, everything that's happening today is really scary, but there's an opportunity to fix a lot of it as we migrate to a more central and cloud-focused architecture.
Lori.
It's the the yin and the yang, right? So if we put everything in a really secure place and everyone's data is there, then one hack will get everything. So right now we're benefiting a bit from being so bifurcated in all of our 100 different places or 200 different places where all the data lives. So but I think that we need like an industry-wide task force to really put something together to teach the studios and teach people who are, especially the guys who are making those decisions about where it's going to be stored, so that we can really mandate what we need, and we can really help derive those standards for our data security. I mean, look, you guys heard about this thing where people take your data hostage. So I'm a pretty savvy tech person. We have a pretty highly secure system in our company. We were hacked. We had to pay Bitcoin to get all of our data back from 20 years of data. And what happened was one of my employees was on her Facebook account and somebody phished her, and she just gave information thinking it was somebody asking her from Facebook that needed something, and they got in that way. So there's so many layers that we have to be careful about in terms of our own security and our companies and the host facilities we work with, that we're a long way out. But the good news is we're all aware of it now. It's not like we think, oh, it'll never happen to me. Well, I don't think that anymore.
Lori, what are
Okay.
Ian or Lori, what are one or two things that you find is happening that maybe not everyone in the audience knows that we can share, that can be some practical advice for today?
In terms of security? Well, I'm not a security expert, but we all, I think, spend a lot of time monitoring how to protect our creative content. But if you go back to the theme of digital disruption, and it's not all disruption, right? It's a great word. The fact is that tech is here to help and to be our friend, but we have to manage it, right? So, as an example, when we are releasing a film that may go to 100+ countries, it gets there digitally, right? There's no prints anymore, right? You just send it down, some Ethernet thing, and it comes out, right? And it comes out the other end and turns into a film, right? So for every reel, for every sound file, for every visual effects, everything is being transmitted first in temp form, then in final form, and it gets rendered out, and all of that stuff is sitting on who knows how many computers and drives all around the world, and people are going to be after it, right? So, when you invest $50, $100, $150 million in a feature film project, that's a real investment and a real risk that needs to be protected. So the security that needs to try to keep pace with the technical advances that we're making. So we all know how to ship it around, right? We all know how to use it, how to ship it and everything, but we still have to have barriers that protect that creative content. And it's something we all work on and think about all the time.
I think with the proliferation, thank you. Proliferation of digital dailies, that's one place that we as producers need to really take a hard look at how we're doing it. Streaming is really hard right now, especially if you're in a remote location for dailies. So what's happening is people are being delivered digital dailies like right onto their iPad or right onto their computer. And that is, I'm kind of just waiting for someone to throw something up on the internet that's a little embarrassing to one of our big actors or actresses that is, was done during a take that, as we're playing around on set. And so I would just caution us all to be careful when we're setting up those systems to make sure that if, that there's a mechanism by which you delete the dailies that are there, especially because once people go away. I mean, I've left productions where I have something and I'm hand this to my assistant. I'm like, oh my God, all the dailies are here. I forgot. So, we have to really be mindful. And in our productions, I like to have someone who's either my DIT or my DP who has someone on his team that is responsible for making sure that that data then gets taken off of what the devices are before we all go off to our next production.
In the early days, 5 years ago, the Motion Picture Association took standards from a lot of other industries and adapted them to our industry. And it's made a huge difference. I can guarantee you that a lot of content would have escaped that gotten out to the internet that didn't because of that. I think we're entering a new area, and the two big areas that concerned me for a long time is one, what you said is on set. There's a lot of good stuff there, and then the other is cloud. Yeah. And so I love your idea. I mean, I would encourage us to work together to update those standards. I know a lot that's going on, but it needs to happen as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I've been talking with some of the other studio CTOs about is forming a group to tell the providers like Google and Amazon that are trying to get our business, tell them what we need. because
Great
I don't
idea.
think they know. We need low cost, we need fast, so that we don't have to ship disk drives around. So I think, honestly, I think in our industry, we hold the cards right now, because there's a huge amount of potential business out there for those providers, and I think they're ready to work with us.
I totally agree with you, and I think we have to get ahead of it, because if we don't, Google and Microsoft are going to release something that they say, hey guys, use our system, and it's not going to be up to our standards or something that we really need. And it's what happened with digital distribution online. We let the tech industry drive it instead of us drive it. So let's learn from that and start driving the cloud storage systems.
So we're going to shift over to some of the other creative opportunities that you have. How is HDR, higher resolutions, some of these features, how are they impacting the way you work?
Well, for me, I mean, I was like the knucklehead who 4 years ago said, well, if you're going to shoot 4K, you might as well protect it for HDR. And, you know, it's, I didn't realize who
Instigator.
three people in the room were. But it was true, because, I mean, I had seen prototypes of what might be 6 years ago and knew that it was, I mean, it was truly that promise of it was a better pixel. It was something you didn't need necessarily resolution to see, but it was reproducing content in your image in a very engaging way. And it doesn't mean you're going to make it so bright you're going to blind people and stuff. It's just it's a greater palette, which makes storytelling more engaging. But for me, you know, coming from doing feature films, I was always used to shooting for that, having a wide range, having a very detailed negative at that time, and then digital files, and then selecting what we needed for to tell a story. So for me, it's more what is the distribution side of it going to be. It's the different methods that it can go out, either in Dolby Vision, or if it's hybrid log gamma. I mean, there are all these methods right now. But I was used to envisioning in my head what a print would look like the next day. So for me, doing something that's going to be HDR, I mean, we always had deliverables. We had the theatrical version of a film. We had the high definition version. We had a standard def version. We had different color spaces. We had the airline version, which I never look at, because every seat they look different. But so you know, that deliverable cycle, you know, is familiar. But I think you know, shooting with that in mind, you know, my belief is that HDR is here to stay. It's like when we went from black and white to color, and then from color to 65 millimeter. It's something that's a very solid way of presenting content, and there's a few things to learn with it. But if you do the things like, you know, like we all talk about, you do some tests beforehand, you know which traps not to kind of fall into. But if you come from the side of feature filmmaking, it's much easier to I think, much easier to move into being creative with it in all these other platforms.
So for the audience, just to get a show of hands, how many of you have already had to deliver something in high dynamic range? Okay, just a few. Is it conversations that you're actively having about upcoming projects? Okay.
Can I just,
So there, go ahead,
I
Lori.
just want to give, like, for those of you who haven't seen HDR or high dynamic range, the consumer electronics industry has been really helpful in saying, hey, if you guys start delivering this, here's the kinds of things we can do. Have you guys ever, you know, turned a movie on that you did or a friend of yours did in your living room? It's really bright and you're looking at the movie and you can't see it, or it's really dark and it's way too bright. These HDR monitors, enabled monitors, can basically sample what the ambient light of the room and adjust what you're seeing so that when you're sitting in a room that's really bright or really dark, you're seeing something that Daryn intended you to see. I'm not sure that airline screens are going to do that, but these really great screens that you'll soon be able to buy and put on your wall will do that. And so for all of us as producers, what you film and what you put out there and what's on the big screen hopefully will be what the consumers are getting in their living room in 5 or 10 years.
And also just to be clear that this is not the same as brightness.
Absolutely.
What it is you have a wider range and you can dial it up or dial it down depending on what you want for your creativity. But there are already a number of different high dynamic range formats, HGL, Dolby Vision. So Ian and Lori, how are you managing that on the post-production and delivery side?
Managing which part?
High dynamic range and the different formats.
Well, the different formats, if you take Transformers as an example, we shoot on so many different camera platforms. We'll use GoPros, Reds, some film cameras, IMAX 3D, Reds. So we have a ton of different formats that all eventually have to be blended together, and that all works fine, right? There's no issue with matching or anything in that realm. For me, what's interesting is if you go back to the beginning, what this panel, was sort of intended for, I think, was the creative versus the disruption, right? So I think, hearing from, everybody up here, everything is faster, everything is easier, right? You just shoot, through your film. As Daryn was saying earlier, you can shoot with very small LED lights. You don't need as an example, I shot on a hillside at night, and we had one lamp that was about that big, right? And the cameras and the sensors are so sensitive now, you don't need a lot of light. So all of that front end of the equation is super easy, right? It all starts loading up on you after you do that, right? So the impact editorially, DITs, storage, more people to manage all of that data. So it comes with a price. So there's an ease and then there's a complexity. And I think as certainly as producers, that's one of the things you have to manage is how many cameras, can you really effectively deal with? What are the sensors? Are you 4K, 8K? What are you going for? Certain directors really like to push it, right? They really want the highest level of image that you can eventually put on that screen that Lori was just talking about. So you have to factor all of that stuff in. It's kind of a partial answer, I think.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about how all of this digital disruption is affecting your schedule. How does it affect your production schedule, your post, and how much time are you allowing for deliverables at the end?
Well, on my side, we go all the way to the finish line, like literally. All right. So I think the ability to have digital files allows you absolute flexibility until the very moment you have to put your pencils down. I was on the stage late last night, and Mike wanted to take out a visual effects element from a shot, and we're all like, this is like 2 a.m, right? So that shot's now done. ILM removed the 2 pieces that he didn't like, sent the files back down at 5 o'clock, and they're now on their way to their destination. You couldn't do that. You couldn't do it 10 years ago. You can't do it with film, right? All those elements have changed now. So all of that facilitates creativity, right? You can change things, you can adjust things. You could sit at company 3 or its competitors, and you can change any facet of any frame in any part of the frame and change the light levels and adjust the color and all of that stuff. It's fantastic, right? You're changing what Daryn does a bit, but Daryn knows going in that that's going to happen and sits there at the color session and helps do all those changes. All that stuff is fabulous, right? But eventually it catches up. It catches up with money. It catches up with people. Your crew size expands to deal with all the extra new stuff that is actually helping you, right? So there's no free lunch is the adage.
I think from a practical standpoint, I always have my DP on speed dial. And I used to say have your DP available for 2 weeks in post. I now have about 50% more, 3, sometimes 4 weeks, because of these new deliverables that start coming in. And especially when they ask you for a deliverable that wasn't in the original. And I also would say your line item, we used to have about 150,000 for our kind of mid-range deliverables. We add another 50% now for the new 4 or 5 deliverables that you need to send to the distributor and studios. So just from a practical standpoint. And I just wanted to add to this LED conversation. When we were in Africa, normally we went to like 5 countries in Africa. Normally I would have had lighting packages at each of those places. I would have worked with a lighting house. We carried these great LED panels just with us on the planes, and it was so great because we had our camera, we had our lighting, we had everything, and we're going to a remote village in the Omo Valley in Ethiopia with hand carrying our packages and getting amazing images. So it really, from the creativity standpoint and being able to be really facile with your team, it's a really great thing.
With all of these creative and speed options, how does this affect costs? What's changing? Ian and Lori, let's start. What's changing on your budgets? What are you thinking about differently?
Well, staffing increases. You used to have X number of cameras, X amount of film, X amount of lab costs, and all of that. So I would say candidly, certainly on the bigger movies, the tentpole type of movies that I've done a couple of, they're more expensive. Right, and if you carry, the more gear you have, the more cameras you have, the more you're going to shoot, the more cards you have, the more storage you have, the more editorial you need. So I'm going to keep classified the number of picture editors that we've had on this most recent picture, just because of the amount of data, right? And obviously creatively they get assigned different sequences and everything, but there's just more bodies that are needed to deal with with the amount of footage and the different destinations and all the deliverables. So it's sort of it's like the inverse pyramid, right? And it just widens out and gets increasingly bigger. And the tech is there to help us. Tech expands very rapidly. We're going with it, right? And now we can shoot 8K. What's next?
Well, just to say something that's next that's really exciting, and this isn't next year or the year after that, but we're working on some really incredible artificial intelligence ways of enabling filmmaking, such as automated roto. And in the long run, at least for the roto part of the life cycle, that could reduce some of the costs. So we already have one tool that's able for previs to do a decent job of roto, so you can very quickly turn around and see what something's going to look like and play with it. There's even a tool, and this is almost heresy to say this, especially with my spouse in the room here. We're working on a tool that works on automated color correction.
Impossible.
So I know that's scary.
No.
Let me just say.
Let's clarify that.
Let me just.
Hello,
let me
Siri.
just-
Make it look good.
No. let me say where I think that can go. One is there are certain low cost productions that don't have the budget for a color. So there is going to be a way to take a first pass and produce something at a lower cost that looks, maybe it's not going to look as good as it would otherwise, but it's going to at least do something. And then there's also the take a first pass at the color correction and produce metadata, so then the colorist can focus on the really creative aspects of color correction and not the grunt work, because there's also a lot of grunt work involved at the beginning of color correction of stuff that someday will be able to be at least take a first pass at it. We will never, ever replace the creativity of a colorist or a great visual effects artist. But I think what we're going to be able to do in 3 to 5 years is help jumpstart the process and reduce the cost at least of that first piece.
Daryn?
Oh no, I agree with that. I mean, I think that anything to get the process going so that you don't have to do that sort of first week of management of what do we have here. I think would be great.
This is not a technology problem. It's really a workflow and a planning problem. And I guess I would say one of the approaches we've taken as a camera manufacturer, and others as well, is to allow the look to be defined on the set by the cinematographer, but then easily communicated downstream to editorial and to the finishing operations. And we've actually now, at the urging of our customers, added look files in the camera, a whole range of different things, not to deliver final color, but to deliver an indication of the creative intent, and that actually travels with the files. And again, if you set up the workflow right, it goes to editorial, it goes to VFX, it goes to finishing, and it provides a good starting point for the final creative color decisions in post.
Yeah, I think certainly in TV, we couldn't do it any other way.
Yeah.
If we weren't setting the look on set, by the time we got to editorial and needed to be on screen, we'd be toast. So.
I mean,
The other benefit to digital, I mean, there's many benefits to digital, but the sharing of files between those different entities, between a color house, a visual effects house, the edit room, the mixing stage, those files move really quickly now. So you can sit on the stage. And the example I gave of the visual effects shot, okay, turn that into a sound file. Suddenly you don't like something in sound, you need a piece, from the dailies. And so you literally call the cutting room, and it shows up 3 minutes later, and they can cut it in. So all of that goes to the efficiency of digital, which it's magnificent. There's just you can't say enough about it. So all of that, we're on the cutting edge of sharing. And it's all because of digital.
And globally, and globally, this is going to get a lot easier. So again, I'm talking 3 years out, 3 to 5 years out. The end game is to do less movement of data. So the nirvana is upload it from the set to one place and then let everybody work on the same data globally. That's the dream. We're not even close to that. But back to the idea of working with some of the bigger partners who have global networks, like Amazon and Google and the like, and you start to see, and these are part of the discussions that we're having with them, you start to see that really could happen. And then that makes a huge difference from a security standpoint and also from a time standpoint. If the data's all in one place and you can manipulate it from anywhere, and this will happen, that speeds things up and it can reduce the costs.
With digital technology, we've seen new roles come along, like the DIT, for example. As we move toward, as we move toward working in the cloud more often, and some of these other changes, are there other responsibilities or new roles that you think will be needed on a production?
Well, I always bring on not just a post supervisor, but a post producer. And I have them start during production and sometimes during pre-production, because I think it's so important to get all the way through deliverables. And I'm there working on the creative side of things. I really need someone who does the deep dive with my DP and the director to make sure that the deliverables that are and it takes someone who's has more producer chops as well, because as you know, I mean, not all of us have the benefit, like Ian did, of having a 5 o'clock this morning deadline to get to China. But so, if we don't have a date where your film is going to open, this, it's easy for that to kind of keep creeping. And so it's really great to have someone at your side. So post-producer, DIT, I would absolutely have someone on set. It's not really a union position yet, which is your security person, someone who's handling your IT from the user standpoint.
Now, on the deliverables, there's one thing I did want to touch on. So, you have the ability to give audiences 3D if they'd like it. You have the ability to show high dynamic range. We have IMAX. We have local languages, obviously. We have immersive sound. I have to ask, Ian, how many versions of Transformers did you deliver this week? Or do you know the total?
No, I can't tell how many, but just as examples, 2D China Monday, 3D China Tuesday, IMAX 3D China Wednesday, US rest of the world Thursday, Friday, and a little bit of straggling today. So there's just massive quantities of data in different formats that are shipping. And as Lori was saying, in terms of having like a post supervisor or somebody, like we have somebody in the edit room who's like a mini producer who's really an editor, because there's so much data that only they understand. They, we don't understand how to do it. I'm fairly facile with post, but it's so detail oriented, and down to the level of files and color and shots and all of that stuff. So we've sort of installed like an associate producer type in the edit room, right, just to help manage all of the information and how it needs to flow in and out of there, because there's just so much. And 3D is a whole other world and animal that we all have to keep up with, in terms of making sure all those files, like both left and right eye. Like sometimes, like we had something yesterday fell out where one of the files didn't come across in 3D in both eyes, right? So everybody's like running back to the cutting room and retrieving all of that data, right? So it's a massive amount of information that needs to be managed, and it's there to help, but we have to also help it, right? It doesn't just happen on its own.
So one deliverable, I think we're going to get to this, but another deliverable that people are thinking about on set now is VR and AR. And it's going to come with all the same issues that we had to deal with getting film to match and film to look good. So is there a different role for a person on a set dealing with VR? Maybe it becomes part of the DIT role, but there's also an artistic component to it, to be able to see a regular scene and say, okay, what are we going to do in VR with this? And are there implications on the way the shoot is done and lighting is done based on subsequent VR?
That was the next topic I wanted to touch on. So let's start with a show of hands. How many of you are exploring VR or have produced VR so far? A lot. Okay. So, so for our panelists, what are the questions right now, and how is this fitting into your workflow?
So we're investing a lot in VR, and we believe it's going to take longer for it to be profitable than people think. It's got a lot of hype now. I don't know if you've seen the Gartner hype cycle, but things tend to go like this, and then they go like this. We're kind of right here right now, because people, when you experience VR, I think for the first time, you realize the potential of it. That's all you do. The VR experiences that are out there today, the resolution is not where it could be. The color isn't there yet. But you can see, oh my gosh, this is really going to make a difference for us. So what we're doing is all of our business units are producing lots and lots of VR content right now. But let me tell you something, the workflow is a nightmare. It reminds me, and I'm old enough to remember this, it reminds me of the early days of DI, when we didn't know how we were going to get a film to the screen. And a lot of us, spent many nights, all-nighters, trying to figure out the workflow. We're at the same point in VR right now. So for us, it's like film to digital all over again in a funny sort of way. It's really expanding how do you tell a story in VR, and what are the workflows, and all of it reminds me so much of the past.
Lori, how are you?
Well, I think the biggest opportunity really is from the producing standpoint is, how do you tell a story? Just like Bob was saying, in VR, what's the point of view? How do you even write a VR script? Like what are the tools that we're going to eventually use in 5 or 10 years when we're doing a 10 or 11 minute, what do they say? They say 5 or 6 minutes is what people can take. 11, they're just barely getting nauseous. But so let's say an 11-minute script, right? And it's VR. You have 360. How do you describe it literally on the scripted page? More than one person can be talking at the same time. How are you getting people's attention? This is something that we, as producers, I think, should try to get in and crack. And I think that we have a chance to lay out the way scripts should be laid out for production, the way storytelling needs to be thought of. Is there just one director on set? What do you tell the actors? All these things. And I think these shorter shorter examples of things that we're using more, I think, for PR purposes now. So if we're doing VR, it's really kind of a gimmick to get people to go see the real thing on the big screen. I think that these are our opportunities to really kind of alpha and beta test what are the storytelling mechanisms that we're going to start using in the future when, I don't know, I think 16K is what we need for VR, and 16K 360 is whole heck of a lot of way
data.
more than petabytes of data.
Well, and it's more than one camera. It's an array of cameras generally. So, so a lot will change in terms of the techniques for, for camera and lighting. I'll let Daryn talk to that a little bit, but I did want to say one of the things we're doing, and Technicolor sort of took the lead at this in setting up a education center. It'll be opened on Thursday
next
this week, this coming week, yes. And
Pay to get in.
and we are no, it's not a
I
paid
can get
experience. See, he can get you in. But we are one of quite a few industry partners who will join with them to help demonstrate the technology for camera and lighting in our case, but also in Technicolor's case for the stitching and finishing of these images to get the best results. But we're all learning, and we're learning very quickly right now because the technology is changing very quickly.
Can I add something too? Because I have a couple of, I have a gamer at my house. So I think there's expectations and quality levels that we are so accustomed to. When you look at this and the iPad and the big iPad and the 8K TV that you see when you walk into Best Buy or 4K, whatever it is, but all of those things set in your eye and your brain an expectation of what we should be looking at. So I think one of VR's challenges is, as Laurie said, figure out what the content is, figure out what the platform is going to be. I mean, for me, walking around with that umbilical cord, I want to shoot myself, right? But I've seen a couple of things that relate to this, and you go, okay, that's it, right? Like I go, if I took that home and gave it to my son, he might not put it down in a hurry. Right?
I mean, I too have a gamer, and he should be moved out of the house, but he isn't yet. I think I'm going to have to slow down our internet connection. But I mean, I see, for me, it's like how we moved into all these other technologies. But I think doing these smaller projects and just getting a feel for what it is. And yes, I mean, just looking at cardboard and this with your eye, it's engaging. But I think there's an opportunity there because with my son, I could never talk to him about what life is like in an African village that doesn't have water. But he could look at that for 3 minutes. Doesn't have to be high resolution, but we can figure out how to tell that story quickly. And we can engage a whole different generation, I think, while this is sort of this novelty new thing. So I think there's a great opportunity, even though we haven't fully flushed out the technology. You don't have to do it to deliver a really compelling message in this medium, knowing that it's immersive and they can discover it. So I think it's a time to just start doing things like that, where we can actually use it to affect social change, and then we also get the byproduct is how to tell stories and work out the rest of it.
And it's still very early, and the penetration of the headsets is still an issue, and that's why companies like IMAX are starting to put them in public places so more people can experience VR for the first time. But when people do experience it for the first time, it's going to be the content. So that really falls on you to be thinking about creating some really interesting, compelling experiences to drive this area. Laurie's nodding. Would you like to add to that?
No, I just think that it's so important, and what Daryn said is really interesting. Like if we can start doing things that are socially motivated, they'll spread faster because those infrastructures already exist in terms of people knowing people. So I like that idea of I might steal that idea.
And the quality, there is a huge quality issue right now. If you if you look at this, it's fantastic, but you can't tolerate it too long because of the pixels. So when we get to 16K, then all the questions that we've answered about digital start to come up, such as, here's one that sounds familiar, how do you get the cinematographer's intent into the headset? And so we're looking at that pipeline, and one of the early experiments we did was we figured out a way to characterize headsets. And we took all the major headsets and compared them to each other. And then we fed a Rec 709 image through the whole pipe to each headset just to see what would happen. Did it reflect the original Rec 709 color space, or did it get different by the time it got to the headset? The answer is it's very different.
Did
and
you
depending on what
you did a headset assessment series?
Correct.
Yes.
Uh-oh, is that next?
We got to figure out the
Lori, is that
acronym
next?
for that. H-A...
But you know what? We need to do that, right? I mean, it's the same thing as, because what's the goal? The goal is that experience becomes better and the user is comfortable.
I think we have some time for questions. Okay, we have some mics coming around. Hi, Steve Scott.
Hi. Yes, Steve Scott, colors from Technicolor.
It's auto color, Steve Scott, isn't it?
Yeah, someone's
an
in
argument
trouble when
coming.
I get talking about the digital disruption, I mean, as technology advances, I have sensed that some of the vendors who are doing amazing things and producing amazing products are driving the show. And it's based on, very often, their interests and what they feel is important. How do you keep the creatives, like Daryn, at the forefront of developing those tools, developing those workflows, assuring that the creativity is paramount in any of these decisions? Because when you're talking about HDR or how to do a proper workflow, it's very easy for somebody to box you in a corner right from the very beginning. And I also have to say that I have been seeing less participation by DPs in some productions. And that is really frightening because you're the author of the images. How do you assure that you are involved and in every phase along the way? And how do you keep the workflows being generated by the creative needs as opposed to the business needs of the contractors and vendors?
Well, for myself, I always made it a point to know as much as I could. And it was to the point where, in the early days of DI, where I knew more than I wanted to know. But I come from, making small movies up to big and small, different things. So to me, it's like time and money, I spend it like it's my own. So I want to make sure it's on the screen. And also, I truly believe, even though there's an area that, definitely I have to wrangle when it's shoot day, I have to make sure we are moving and doing things. It's always in partnership. I mean, I know it sounds, it truly is for myself. It's partnership with the producer, the director, the editor, because even I know that after I can see what, what the look of the movie would be, what the workflow, what I think the most efficient way to get to the end is. Of course, in that time frame between, I've seen it happen, a movie I did here at Fox where it changed what they wanted the deliverable to be from 2K to 4K from shooting to the final DI point. But I know that even though I set a look and the tempo of how it should arc with the story, until I see that cut, I'm willing to change that to service the story. And I think you have to keep, the way to do it is, you have to keep that relationship if you're interested in that. It'd be easy for me to just go from movie to movie to movie and just, but for me, that's part of making the process better. So I just stay involved and keep that relationship and that channel open. And even though I'm not on payroll, I'm there, as much as I can be, because that's the work that we're all going to have living up there forever, hopefully, if archiving gets its act together.
Okay, we're going to try to get to the next
Anyway.
question because I saw we had a lot of questions and not a lot of time. So who's next?
Hi, I wanted to start off by thanking everybody. I was an early pioneer in digital video 25 years ago, and at the time I was beta testing VR, and it took a lot longer to get here than I thought it was going to. First I just want to thank all of you for actually, pushing the boundaries and advancing the field. And I am working on a VR empathy-based project that I believe has great potential to affect social change, and that's, I think, one of the beautiful promises on that. I just was curious as to if you guys have an idea, tech-wise, especially Bob and Glenn, how far out you might see it before we are actually able to move around in a VR space 360 with film.
I think we can do that today. Maybe your question is, when will the consumer be able to do that?
From that perspective.
You just want a crystal ball. I'm going to say, well, first of all, we don't think there's going to be a huge uptake into consumers' homes until at least 3 years from now.
Okay.
And that these it's going to go like this, but the real spike with the hockey stick, as we call it, we think is going to be in 3 years. So if I had to guess, around that time, 3 to 5 years is when we're going to see a lot of this. The other thing that's happening related to that is haptics. So haptics is the ability to sense your body and to touch something in VR and feel it on your hand or feel it in your body. I think not only sensing your movement, allowing you to touch things that aren't there, that's all coming. And so that's probably in the 5-year horizon.
Okay, thank you.
Glenn, do you have anything to add, or should we go to the next question?
Well, there was actually a recent report from PricewaterhouseCoopers, I think it was, that said it's going to happen a lot faster than that. But I think it is happening in the game world very quickly. I'm still a little skeptical how quickly it'll be embraced in long form narrative storytelling, whether that's TV or features, because the technique and the whole language has to be redeveloped for that. So I think that'll be much longer, and maybe it won't be embraced in long form.
Okay, next question.
Hi, just a flip side of that first question. Do you guys ever find resistance in trying to expand how directors and DPs use technology? Obviously, Daryn is very caught up on everything, but how do you expand ingrained artistic choices with ever-changing technology?
Well, you have to take sort of what works at that moment, because that's how you have to decide on how to proceed for the next 6 months or whatever, or even shorter production. So it's sort of taking a snapshot of what you can do at that time and not risk the production, not risk, by trying to do something so different that there's that chance that it's going to hinder the release of it. So it's basically just taking those steps and going for it.
There's a fine line between the cutting edge and the bleeding edge.
Yeah.
So you want to find someone who's willing to take a few risks, like you might be, and but also go to the tried and true.
We had a few more questions.
Hi. This session has been fascinating and based on the number of people on the panel, focused entirely on the visuals. Could either, I guess, Lori and Ian address a little bit what has been the changing impact on the audio deliverables for projects like this? I can imagine VR is all kinds of crazy for audio.
Yeah.
Have 4K and 8K created additional expectations and additional deliverables for audio?
Bob, you want to do that?
Yes, I can do that. You're right. It's sound in VR is a whole different animal. When you turn your head in VR or move in a space, if the sound doesn't follow, you get sick really fast, right? If he's talking and if Daryn is talking and I hear his voice over there and I go like this, the voice has to move. But also what changes with it is the sound of the voice, and the quality changes depending on the direction. So if Daryn is behind me, it sounds different than he's in front of me, yet me as the user, I'm able to turn my head wherever I want. So the answer is, you're absolutely right. We're working on this, and you're now dealing with sound in a 3-dimensional space where you have to have a very complex interplay between the visual and the sound, or you drive your user crazy.
Even in 8K, our sound mixer has an array of mics that he's using for the ambient sound. He's miking the actors that are on camera, but he also has the ambient sound that's going to eventually fill the theater.
And those VR sound standards are very much in discussions. So, yes, next question.
Hi there. My name is Batia, and I wanted to sort of flesh out a little bit of what Bob was saying about sort of the dream of cloud computing at a global level. I can give you a laundry list of reasons why it can actually be a nightmare. From currency arbitrage to differences in intellectual property rules and labor laws and getting money to people. I mean, it can be a real headache. And I'm curious if anybody on the panel has had an experience recently where some of those things are disappearing, where we're sort of willing to give up the family feeling that we have on creating a film from start to finish together for what we might look at as like a global talent pool advantage. Thanks.
If you want to see some results of this, the answer is you're right, all of the above. And part of what I get to do, because I'm a CTO, is have a vision and not, and then I can worry about some of this other stuff with the people I work with. So you're right, those are all issues. If your question is, are there examples out there? There's a site I would encourage everyone to go to called artella.com, and it's a global site. Formed by some leaders in, I believe they're from ILM, but their idea was we should be able to do animation, creative animation, storytelling globally without ever having everyone in the same place. And if you look at that, there's actually a feature being produced on that right now, being financed out of China. So it is possible. There are security issues too. There are all kinds of issues around it, but I'm confident that we're going to be able to work through those issues. And why am I confident? Because other industries have dealt with this, and I think we'll deal with it too. And that's why, going back to what Lori is saying, is we as an industry need to be in the driver's seat here and be meeting with the vendors and telling, here's what we need, here's what we care about. So that's one example. For us internally, we're doing this internally first. So for right now, today, a production that we do, say, for visual effects, it's not worked on in one location. For many of our VFX shows, it's 24/7, and India hands off to London, and London's hands off to Montreal, hands off to LA. So we're already doing it internally, and yes, there are laws even around that we have to deal with, but I have to think the case for this is so compelling, we will be able to deal with those issues.
Okay, I think we have room for one more question.
Just curious if any of you have encountered any difficulties that are particular to making and or delivering content to streaming networks.
Glenn, do you want to start with that one?
Well, I mean, from the standpoint of a camera manufacturer, there is one very large investor in original content right now, Netflix, that has a very tight specification on the origination. In fact, our cameras don't meet their spec today. But I did want to say there are many other streaming videos delivery mechanisms with Amazon, for example, and Hulu and others that don't really set the spec up front. They have a spec for delivery, and they let the creative people or the production team make the decision on their tools. So, for example, we do have a lot of shows on Amazon right now shooting with the Alexa camera. They're shooting at 3.2K and finishing in UHD and HDR. And frankly, it's the HDR that drove that choice creatively because of the dynamic range of the camera. But it depends on the channel, if you will. Everyone's different, so you have to look into their delivery specifications.
I would say, as a producer, my biggest issue with dealing with streaming services is their lack of transparency on how many people are watching our data, watching our content. And for me, this would be a really great thing if we can start breaking through to those distribution platforms.
Okay, we do have to wrap up, but thank you so much. We do have to wrap up, but I'm sure they'll be here for a bit. Thank you so much for your great questions, and please join me in thanking our speakers.